Clara had always prided herself on being the devoted wife, the steady anchor in her marriage to Thomas. Their life together was full of routines, family dinners, casual weekend outings, and an easy companionship that made her feel secure. But when Thomas received a sudden offer for a week-long business trip overseas, something inside Clara shifted. It was a rare opportunity for his career, and while she understood the importance of the trip, the thought of being alone in their home for the first time in years made her uneasy. The silence that followed Thomas's departure felt deafening. She had gotten used to his presence, his voice echoing through their home, filling the spaces with life. Now without him, the house seemed too large, too empty. Clara found herself drifting through the days, filled with a strange restlessness she couldn't explain. She worked from home, went on walks around the neighborhood, and watched TV, but nothing seemed to fill the void. She realized just how much she had relied on Thomas for emotional support, and now that he was gone, she felt a growing sense of isolation. For the first time in a long while, Clara started questioning her own desires and needs, unsure of what was missing but knowing something had shifted inside her. As the days passed, Clara's restlessness grew. What started as a quiet reflection on her own solitude began to feel like an unsettling undercurrent. She found herself grappling with a familiar emptiness, the kind that comes from being disconnected, not just from others, but from herself. Thomas had always been the one to anchor her, the one she leaned on for reassurance when the weight of life felt too heavy. With him away, Clara realized how much of her identity had been wrapped up in her role as his wife. It was inescapable. She was no longer the woman who had dreams and desires beyond their family life. The realization gnawed at her, and she felt a longing for something she couldn't name. It wasn't about missing Thomas, at least not entirely. It was more about missing the spark she once had, the person she had been before motherhood and routine consumed her. Her world had become a series of well-worn paths, and now with Thomas gone, she felt both the loneliness and the freedom that came from being alone. But it was a freedom laced with anxiety, the gnawing fear of losing herself in the process. Clara needed to find a way to reconnect with her own dreams again, before it was too late. By the third day of Thomas's absence, Clara found herself lost in thought more often than not. What had initially felt like a welcome respite from the usual hustle began to feel suffocating. Her mind wandered back to the person she used to be, the woman who dreamed big, laughed easily, and embraced the thrill of new experiences. That woman seemed far removed from the wife and mother she had become. She tried to fill the silence by watching TV, but the flickering images on the screen only highlighted the emptiness she felt. It wasn't just the loneliness though, it was the realization that she had been so absorbed in everyone else's needs that she had forgotten her own. The weight of this truth was heavy, and it was all-consuming. She missed feeling like herself, but it also scared her. What if she had changed so much that the woman she once was no longer existed? That thought alone kept her up at night, tossing and turning, wondering how to reclaim a part of herself that seemed so out of reach. The sense of restlessness inside her grew stronger, pushing her towards something she wasn't sure she was ready for, yet couldn't ignore. As the days passed, Clara's emotions became a tangled web of guilt and longing. Despite the deep connection she shared with Thomas, the increasing attraction she felt toward Jason disturbed her. The line between friendship and something more blurred, and she couldn't help but feel both guilty and exhilarated. This growing attraction was like a dangerous spark, thrilling but potentially destructive. Clara found herself torn between the comfortable, predictable life she had with Thomas and the undeniable chemistry she felt with Jason. Her longing for something more, something that stirred her soul, made her question what she truly wanted. As she navigated the delicate balance between the love she had for her husband and the excitement Jason evoked, Clara was forced to confront her own desires and needs. The tug of attraction was not just about Jason, but about a deeper sense of self that Clara had neglected for too long. She had to ask herself, was she living authentically, or had she suppressed parts of herself in the name of duty? The fear of stepping outside her comfort zone kept her rooted in indecision, but the possibility of rediscovering her true self made her wonder if embracing change was worth the risk. As Clara and Jason continued their conversations, the tension between them deepened, creating a strange blend of guilt and excitement. What started as friendly banter soon felt like a forbidden game, the lines between friendship and something more becoming increasingly blurred. Clara knew she was crossing a line, yet every word from Jason seemed to stir something inside her that she hadn't felt in years. The thought of being seen, truly seen, by someone other than Thomas was intoxicating. Each text message, every conversation left her with a restless energy, a feeling she hadn't experienced since before her marriage. And when they met for coffee, the world around her seemed to fade away, leaving only Jason's presence, his smile, his attention. It wasn't just the thrill of the moment, it was the reminder of who she had been before life's responsibilities had buried her desires. But as the days passed, a heavy guilt clouded the excitement. Clara couldn't deny that the connection between her and Jason was undeniable, but the consequences of allowing it to grow were too great to ignore. She loved Thomas, had built a life with him, and yet, the part of her that longed for passion and excitement was more alive than ever, forcing her to confront the complexity of her emotions. The guilt weighed heavily on Clara as she replayed the events of the last few days. Jason's presence had stirred something within her that she couldn't quite shake, and it felt like a dangerous secret she was carrying. Every time she looked at Thomas, her loving husband, she was consumed with a sense of betrayal, even though nothing physical had transpired between her and Jason. But the emotional connection, the spark that had reignited within her, felt too intense to ignore. As much as Clara tried to push those thoughts aside, they crept into every moment of her day. She found herself questioning what had been missing from her marriage with Thomas. Their life was steady, comfortable, and full of love, but where was the excitement, the passion, the thrill that came with being seen and desired in a way she hadn't been in years? The more she spoke to Jason, the more she realized how much she craved that connection, that feeling of being truly understood. But it wasn't just about Jason. It was about her own sense of self, a part of her that had been buried under the weight of responsibility and routine. Clara's restlessness grew, and the tension of living in two worlds became unbearable. Clara's world began to feel like a delicate tightrope, each step she took threatening to pull her further from the life she had always known. The conversations with Jason were becoming more frequent, the messages more charged. What had once seemed like harmless companionship now felt like a doorway to something far more dangerous. She found herself replaying moments, wondering if she had crossed a line, even though nothing had physically happened between them. Still, the emotional weight of it all hung over her like a storm cloud, and she couldn't shake the sense that she was teetering on the brink of something irreversible. It wasn't just the thrill that Jason brought her, it was the way he made her feel alive again, seen in ways she hadn't been in years. Meanwhile, Thomas remained in the background, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Clara knew her marriage with him was built on trust, but the cracks were starting to show, and she feared that if she didn't confront the truth soon, she might lose everything. Torn between guilt and desire, Clara felt like she was suffocating in her own indecision. The weight of unspoken feelings, buried long ago, seemed impossible to ignore any longer. As Clara sat alone in her living room, the quiet of the house pressed down on her, thick and suffocating. She couldn't stop thinking about the last conversation with Jason, the unspoken words between them hanging in the air like a charged storm cloud. What had she been looking for in him? She loved Thomas, her husband, the man she had built a life with, but Jason made her feel something she hadn't felt in years: desire, excitement, a spark of life that she had buried under the weight of motherhood and routine. The uncertainty of her emotions gnawed at her, pulling her in different directions. Clara knew she had to make a choice before the situation spiraled further. Could she push aside the thrilling connection she shared with Jason and focus solely on her family, or was she destined to break the fragile bond she had with Thomas? The stakes had never felt so high. She had never imagined her marriage would be tested like this, but the heart was a powerful thing, and it had a mind of its own. As she reflected on her choices, she realized the fear of making the wrong decision would haunt her for much longer than the temporary thrill of the unknown. She needed clarity, and soon. Clara woke up the next morning with an unsettling sense of dread weighing heavily on her chest. The night before had shifted something inside her, leaving her both relieved and anxious. Mark's departure had felt like a painful yet necessary finality, but the consequences of their near breach lingered in the air like a shadow, dark and looming. As Thomas arrived home from his business trip, Clara greeted him with a smile that barely masked the turmoil inside her. He was back, safe and sound, and their life could resume its normal rhythm, at least on the surface. But beneath her calm exterior, Clara was lost in a storm of conflicting emotions. She loved Thomas, she truly did, but the brief moments of connection with Jason had cracked open a door to something new, something thrilling, and she wasn't sure she could shut it again. As they sat down for dinner, Thomas began recounting his trip, the sound of his voice grounding her in the present. She nodded along, trying to force herself back into the comfort of their shared life. But the more she listened, the more she realized that the familiar routine she had longed for felt strangely hollow now. The uncertainty in her heart grew louder, gnawing at her with every passing second. The days after the confrontation with Jason were a blur of exhaustion and guilt for Clara. It was as if she had opened a door that could never be closed again. Thomas, ever the devoted husband, hadn't noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, but Clara felt like a stranger in her own skin. Every conversation with him felt distant, as though the foundation of their life together had cracked, even if he couldn't see it. The more she tried to pretend everything was fine, the more she realized that it wasn't. The connection she had felt with Jason, though brief, had awakened something inside her that she couldn't easily ignore. But at the same time, the thought of losing her family, her home, the life she had carefully built with Thomas, terrified her. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about her own sense of self. Clara had spent so many years as a wife and mother that she had forgotten who she was outside of those roles. Her longing for excitement, for something more, was rooted in the silent desperation to rediscover herself. And as she sat quietly, watching her children play in the yard, she realized the truth: she needed to reclaim who she was before she could move forward. Clara had always prided herself on being the steady anchor in her family, but after the emotional whirlwind with Jason, she found herself questioning everything. The guilt of her actions weighed heavily, each thought filled with regret, but at the same time, a small part of her was relieved. For the first time in years, she had confronted the parts of herself that she had buried, the parts that yearned for excitement, for connection beyond the responsibilities of being a wife and mother. Yet, as the days passed, Clara's heart and mind remained conflicted. She still loved Thomas, more than she could express, but the emotional and physical boundaries she had crossed with Jason left her feeling fractured. The realization that she had sought validation outside her marriage was a harsh truth. It forced her to look at her relationship with Thomas through a new lens, one that wasn't just about maintaining appearances, but about honesty, vulnerability, and mutual growth. She knew that if they were to move forward, it would have to be with transparency, acknowledging the cracks that had formed, and the ways they had both neglected their needs. But could they rebuild what they had, or was the damage irreversible? Clara wasn't sure, but she knew that this journey had only just begun. Clara felt a mix of relief and anxiety the moment she hung up the phone with Jason. The confession that had weighed heavily on her chest for weeks now sat there in the air between them, unspoken but palpable. The thrill of the connection they had shared, now just a distant memory, had left her feeling exposed, vulnerable, yet strangely lighter. She had made a choice to set boundaries, to preserve her marriage with Thomas, and for the first time in months, she felt like she was regaining control of her life. But as days passed, the emotional toll of the decision took root. Clara couldn't help but wonder whether her marriage could ever return to the way it had been before. The conversations with Thomas had become strained, the unspoken truth hanging between them like a dark cloud. They were both tiptoeing around the cracks in their relationship, afraid to address them directly. Clara knew they needed more than just apologies or forgiveness. They needed to heal, to rediscover who they were both individually and as a couple. She began to realize that the path forward wasn't going to be easy, but it was essential for their growth. In the silence that followed, Clara found herself asking, would love, trust, and patience be enough to fix what was broken? Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers lightly tracing the worn edges of the comforter, as thoughts swirled relentlessly in her mind. The choices she had made, the path she had walked down, all led her to this moment, a confrontation with herself and everything she had once believed about love and loyalty. Jason's presence had awakened parts of her she hadn't realized were dormant, but now she was faced with the cold truth of her actions. She had betrayed Thomas, not just in a moment of weakness, but in her heart. Clara felt an overwhelming need to make things right, but how could she erase the shadows of uncertainty that had settled between them? What she had with Thomas, the comfort, the history, the love, was slipping through her fingers, and Jason's lingering presence only muddied the waters. The guilt gnawed at her, a constant companion that made every moment spent with Thomas feel like a lie. Could she rebuild what had been shattered? She knew the road to reconciliation would be long and fraught with tension. As Clara sat there, her thoughts scattered like shards of glass, she realized something. This wasn't just about salvaging her marriage. It was about finding herself again, learning to navigate the complexities of her emotions, and learning to trust herself before she could ever rebuild the trust she'd lost with Thomas. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to become overwhelmed by our emotions and desires, especially when we feel disconnected from those closest to us. Clara's struggle shows us the importance of self-awareness and honesty in relationships. If you find yourself at a crossroads, it's essential to confront your feelings rather than avoid them. Avoiding the hard conversations only deepens the divide. Take time to reflect on your own needs and communicate openly with those you love.